All right, so sort of finishing up on Bible authority. We've got the last lesson that we'll probably finish up tonight that's in the workbooks. Next Wednesday, we may do just a brief overview. And if that's the case, I'll pass out the questions on Sunday for that. If not, we'll go into the next class, which will be the names of God, and really the attributes of God as well. But sort of where we've left off and what we've looked at thus far, we've seen the authority and defined what authority was. We've seen the sources of authority from man and from heaven. We've seen our need as seen in the Old Testament, in the New Testament as well, and throughout history. Christ being the source of authority, and the New Testament being the will of Christ. Then we went more into depth on the authority itself with command, example, necessary inference, expediency, general and specific authority, silence of the scriptures, evangelism, edification, and we started last week on benevolence. The goal is to finish that tonight. And sort of where we left off, we started talking about the church being benevolent and providing for the necessities of the saints there at the local congregation. And to start off, we'll start with a question, brief answer. Question number 6. Is there a difference between individual and the church in the work of benevolence? Yes. What would be the difference? Okay. Anybody have anything different?
I think one thing might be for individuals is to share what you have and not to aspire to something grandiose beyond your means.
So there's a lesson there for being smart with your finances. Going into the next point, there were really 3 main points. We looked at the first one last week, how the church may provide for its own needs. The other way that we see in the New Testament, we see 2 others. The next way that we see in the New Testament is one church sending to many churches to supply the needs of the saints. There's only one verse, at least that I can find, where this happens. The church in Antioch sends to brethren in Judea. They're in Acts chapter 11. If somebody wants to read Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. All right, so here we have the only example that I can find in the New Testament of one church sending to really many churches. And the record says that they sent it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. Elders, they're restricted to the local church, thus it's necessarily inferred that they sent to a different local church in Judea where the need existed. So what was the need that the church here needed? What's about to come about? Yeah, a famine. And what's that going to do for the saints? Yeah, they're going to need food. And we talked about that last week, how all of the passages that we've seen have been for the basic necessities. The food, the water, the shelter, clothing, things of that nature. And this wasn't something that they went and stored an abundance of. This was to provide for those daily necessities. So what we see in the New Testament is Antioch, they send to Jerusalem, Bethany, Joppa, Lydia, and Emmaus. What we don't see in the New Testament is Antioch sending it to Jerusalem and then Jerusalem distributing it out to the other congregations that are in need. Now, why is that important? Why did Antioch send to the churches in Judea?
Because they were not the sponsoring church, they were giving to all those churches.
Okay. So the receiving churches, they had needy members whose needs they could not supply, and this was the only reason for them sending the funds. And any local church, they may send the funds to another church or churches when the receiving church has members whose needs they simply cannot supply. Also notice that there's no organization in between Antioch and these other churches. They didn't put together a society of brethren to oversee funds that would go out and be distributed. The only way that we see it is the church sending it directly to the other church who had members in need that they could not provide. The next way that we see churches being benevolent is many churches sending to one church. Another example of this would be 1 Corinthians chapter 6. That should actually be chapter 16, I believe. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Yeah, verses 1 through 3, if somebody wants to read that.
Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up, as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem.
All right, so here we have the church of Galatia. They're going to be sending to the church in Jerusalem. Now when we go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, if somebody wants to read verses 1 through 5 for us.
Now, brothers and sisters, we make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave voluntarily, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation
And then 13 through verse 15.
For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that therefore, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack.
And then chapter 9, verses 1 through 2.
For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints, for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been preparing since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them.
And then Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, verses 25 through 32.
But now I'm going to Jerusalem, serving the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Yes, they were pleased to do so, and they are indebted to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them also in material things. Therefore, when I have finished this, and have put my seal on this fruit of theirs, I will go by way of you to Spain. And I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. Now I urge you, brethren, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers to God for me, that I may be delivered from those who are disobedient in Judea, and that my service for Jerusalem may prove acceptable to the saints, so that I may come to you in joy by the will of God and find refreshing rest in your company.
All right, so what we've seen in all of these verses is a collection of different congregations, different churches that are going to be providing for the needs of the church there in Jerusalem. So we see many churches, they sent funds to Jerusalem. Paul had commanded them to send and approved their sending, thus authorizing our doing as well. So what they did for the same purpose. It was for the necessities of the saints. So what we see is we've seen Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, Corinth, Athens, Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium all sending out to Jerusalem. We didn't have some of them sending out to Corinth and then it going down to Jerusalem. And we didn't have a few of them sending to this benevolent society which would distribute the funds. What we see in the New Testament is those churches sending directly to the church that was in need. So brief answers. Question number 5, has the Lord showed us how the early church did the work of benevolence? Yeah. And what should we gather from that?
To do it the same way.
Yeah, to do it the same way. Now, why should we do it the same way? Yeah, that's where we have our authority. It lies in what God has revealed to us in the New Testament through these inspired writers. So the Jerusalem church, they had members who were in need of temporal things, the necessities of life, which they were unable to supply for. And Paul commanded these churches to send to Jerusalem that there may be equality. So thus the reasoning for sending was for providing for those necessities. Now, equality does not mean that each church had the same number of members. It doesn't mean that they had the same amount of money sitting there with the treasurer. But that there was no need among the saints in any of the churches. That's the equality that's being talked about. The gathering of the manna in the wilderness is really an example of that. Look over in Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 16, it says, "This is what the Lord has commanded, gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent." And the sons of Israel did so, and some gathered much and some little. When they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. So this is what the equality is. You had different number of family members in the house. So those with less family members would gather little. Those with more would gather more. And equally, they gathered what they needed, what was necessary. So the churches that sent to Jerusalem, they had more than those in Jerusalem, but sometime in the future they may be in need as well, and Jerusalem may be the one to supply that need. Yes.
Question 5.
Okay.
When you read the question without what's in parentheses, like you did, has the Lord showed us how the early church did this work? The answer is yes. But if you say, has the Lord showed us how, what organization the early church did this work, then it makes it a different question. Then it was the organization would be the church, but the elders and handling that. I'm not sure. I'm not trying to.
That was poorly worded on my end. The organization being the way in which they went about logistically. Logistically would have been a better word.
Okay, I was trying, the organization, I'm thinking your benevolent society thing, that's what was coming from.
Yeah. So that question was supposed to be more along the lines of how they went about getting the funds to those other congregations that were in need, or the saints that were in need. Question number 7 under the brief answers: is the work of benevolence the major work of the church? What is the major work of the church? Yeah, preaching the gospel.
But it's not a work that can be ignored.
Correct.
Both works have to be accomplished.
Yeah. I think my outline's out of order right now, but that's okay. The work of the church, the major emphasis throughout the New Testament has never been the work of benevolence. It's been about preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus. Benevolence is something that is part of that. That goes towards loving your brother. That goes towards loving God, the one who created us. So these other things, they fall under that umbrella of teaching and preaching the gospel. But the primary focus and the work of the church needs to be spreading the gospel. Question number 8 under the brief answers: for whom has God made the church responsible in the realm of benevolence? Needy saints. The benevolent work of the church was unto the saints. We've seen that in really every single verse. All that believed, Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, them that believed. The disciples, Acts chapter 6 and verse 1. Relief unto the brethren, Acts chapter 11, verse 29. Unto the saints, Romans 15, 25. For the poor saints, Romans 15, 26. Accepted of the saints, Romans 15, 31. Collection for the saints, 1 Corinthians 16, 1. Ministering to the saints, 2 Corinthians 8, verse 4. Supplieth the need of the saints, 2 Corinthians 9, verse 12. And relieve them that are widows indeed, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 16. That's all we've seen in the New Testament, is that the benevolent work of the church was unto the saints, unto them who believed. So there's neither command nor example for the church to engage in the work of this general benevolence. Question number 4 under the talk time: in every instance of benevolent work of the church in the New Testament, who were the recipients? The saints. Does this serve as a pattern for the church today? Why?
It's a method of the pattern that's approved by God.
Yeah. Does the church have divine authority for setting up a program of general benevolence, a program to relieve those of the world? Well, what if, brief answer number 8, should the church have a benevolent program as a means of converting people of the world? But it's for teaching and preaching the gospel.
Well, I just read John 12, 5 through 8, and it said where Jesus was, 4 through 8. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" And this he said not to be careful of the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used it to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial, for the poor you have with you always, but me you will not have." So here's Jesus, saying that you're always going to have the poor, and this money that they had wasn't meant for the poor, or could have had, wasn't meant for the poor. It wasn't something that they were to try to solve the problem of the poor.
Yeah. So we have from Jesus a necessary inference there. But what about the people that say, look at all the good that it's doing? This is just an expedient way of helping some people out, but getting them to Christ.
It mostly doesn't work that way. So it's smokescreen.
Well, they seem to think it works. It's bringing in the numbers.
They're coming for the free food.
But they're learning about Jesus.
No, they're not.
It does end up turning into more of a show than it does teaching about Jesus. But that's typically the argument you're going to hear, It's an expedient form of getting people to sit in the pew and listen to the gospel message. Jason?
There's a saying, it's what you win them with is what you win them to.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to see, get them the things that they use to get them in the door, and they think, oh, look what we did, we got them in the door. But then remove that and see how many stick around.
Yeah.
No.
It's the same principle as helping a widow. Is to be a widow in need. That's the instructions of God. Otherwise, there won't be enough to help those really in need.
Yeah.
It's not God's will that we do that.
Yeah, I think if God wanted us to preach and teach to people in that way of throwing giant parties and throwing these activities to entertain kids, well, He would have given us a clear example or told us that was the way in which He did it. Well, people will go and say, well, the New Testament is just so outdated at this point. That wasn't really a thing back then. But
Jesus fed the 5,000 and the 4,000.
Mhm.
He later told his disciples, they were, and the crowd, you've come for the wrong thing to me. You've come for food and not for teaching.
yeah,
Maybe He would have created us in a way where that would work, but seeing as God, of course, knows His creation inside and out, and how He made us, He knew that wouldn't be effective for those very things. It would take away from His word and what He would want and how He would want it done. It'd be no different than anybody else, having certain things they want done a certain way, and you try to be expedient and it doesn't work out the way it's supposed to, especially if it's things that are important or things that could cause harm, things like that. So that's why things are set up the way they are.
yeah. And you really have the same thing that you saw throughout the entire Old Testament. The people, they would go to God looking for help and assistance. When God provided that help and assistance, they stayed faithful for a little while, but then they started to draw away. They felt like they had it on their own, everything was fine and good, and then they went back to their old ways. And then they didn't come back to Him until they got His assistance again. And that's the way that you see it most of the time, especially even today. You'll see every now and then people that come up and down the road, they're probably homeless, and they're really just looking for a congregation that's going to give them some money. And they may have a true need. They may actually be homeless. They may actually need food. They may actually need something to provide for their basic necessities. And every now and then you'll have somebody that takes advantage of that. They'll come in, somebody gave them some cash, so then they keep coming. And then it's every week, hey, do you have 20 bucks so I can go get my food for the week? And they're not really coming to learn about the gospel. They're coming for that financial help. I like what David says in Psalm 37, verse 4. Really going back to verse 1, it says, "Do not fret because of evildoers. Be not envious towards wrongdoers, for they will wither quickly like the grass and fade like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." Well, if your delight's in the Lord, What's the desire of your heart at that point?
Seek first his righteousness and his kingdom.
Yeah.
All these things we have to do.
I'm going to have what I need. God will provide me with what I need. And because of that, I'm going to glorify Him. And I'm going to constantly seek to be right in His eyes. Any other questions, comments, concerns on benevolence? If not, we're going to do a quick overview. All right, just in a way of quick overview, we've got about 10 minutes left. So we'll quickly go through an overview of the things that we've studied throughout the course, and then starting next Wednesday, we'll go into the providence of God as well as the names of God and the different attributes of God. So the first thing is, what is authority?
Jurisdiction, having the right to make judgments.
The jurisdiction or the right to be able to rule over or make law over a specific type of people or class. So what questions do the chief priest and the elders end up asking Jesus that shows and recognizes those two different sources of authority, both heaven and divine, or heaven and men? What question did the Pharisees or the Jews, what did they ask Jesus that pointed to those two sources of authority from man and from heaven?
By whose authority do
But-
you do these things?
Yeah. By whose authority do you do these things? And what was Jesus' response? Mm-hmm.
He asked them, was John's baptism from God or from man, I believe.
Was John's baptism from God or from man? And if you remember, there was quite a mass amount of people that were listening to John the Baptist at that point. And John the Baptist had gathered substantial support from even the Jews. And they knew if, the Pharisees knew if they answered that it was from man, well, they were going to have an uproar of people that were mad about that answer. And then if they said it was from God, well, that puts them in a bind at that point. So what Old Testament example illustrates the need for authority, or at least one of them? Nadab and Abihu, and what did they do? Strange fire. Yeah. Had there been commands in the past about offering incense? Yeah. But God had not authorized the type or the way in which they had offered this incense unto God. What New Testament reference teaches the need for authority? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The Pharisees asked Jesus. What else?
The so-called Great Commission. In the
Mhm.
Matthew and Mark.
Yeah.
Teach the
Mhm.
world. Some things that I have committed to.
Yeah. So, who has authority in heaven and earth? Jesus. And what is the standard of authority in religion today? the Word of God. And was Jesus the Word of God? Where do we see that? John 1. And what are the two kinds of authority? General and specific. And before a thing can be expedient, it must first be what? Lawful. We talked about expediency also being something that was encouraging as well, uplifting. Does the silence of scriptures authorize anything? No. Let's see. What three ways are there of establishing authority? Command, example, necessary inference. We see authority in evangelism from what we've talked about. What was the work of the church and the work of the individual as far as evangelism goes, and what authority for it? So, what was the New Testament way of the church or the individual evangelizing? Mm-hmm. Preaching, teaching. And what were they preaching and teaching? The gospel, the truth. We talked about authority and edification as well. After those souls are converted, they must be taught how to worship and serve the Lord, and that's the work of edification. Do we have an example of the detailed programs of how the church edified back in the New Testament? Like very specific.
So the aged to teach the younger men,
Mm-hmm.
the older ladies to teach the younger.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. Elders would have oversight and
Mhm.
guard the flock from evil.
Okay. Psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. What about edifying people with pizza parties? Did we see a New Testament example of that? So then why would that not be an appropriate way of edifying others? No authority. So the major takeaway that I hope we can get from the class in and of itself is we need to recognize and we need to understand and accept God's will in everything. If we have no authority for the things that we are doing, are we under the direction of God or the direction of man? Man. So the things that we do, they matter. Listening to what God says, and you'll see people say all the time, where the Church of Christ, they're just so legalistic. It's not about being legalistic. It's about wanting to do what God has commanded us to do. Because I have no right to tell God how He should feel. I have no right to tell God how I'm going to act, because that's the way that I decided what was best. Because God had offered everything for you and me. And we are in no position to usurp our authority over God in any way, shape, or form. Questions, comments, concerns on the class? Jason?
Think about it, it's really something now in other areas of life, like if somebody's studying to be an accountant, they're gonna study that material, and they're gonna follow it to the letter. They're not gonna say, well, accounting's an old profession, this was written a long time ago, I'm gonna do it my way, because they know they fall flat on their face.
Yeah.
But it's funny how when it comes to God's word, it's all, well, that was written way back here, and that doesn't apply today. But in any other area, they would not dare stray from what they're reading and put their own thoughts on it.
Well, if it benefits them, they might. The accountant, if he can make a few extra dollars here and there, he might try to shy away from some of those laws or from some of those ways of doing mathematics. I just fudged a couple numbers.
I think that every, I guess just about every facet of our life, we have to follow some kind of rules and obey. Growing up as kids, we have to obey our parents, and then for school, and then jobs, the laws of the land. But I think people just, as a whole, don't like to be told what to do if they can get away with it. And, I don't know if I've ever said this here before, but when we lived in Texas, we were trying to find us some land to buy. And my brother-in-law and I went out to look at this land, and there were 20-acre lots with trees. Okay, and that wasn't always in Dallas, the trees. And so when we came back, we were telling this fella at work about the land, because he was also looking for some, and one of the restrictions was you couldn't cut down but 20% of the trees. And he said, well, I don't go anywhere, they tell me what I can and can't do. And I said, well, there's plenty of land out here in Texas that don't have trees on it. Just go buy you some land that don't have trees and let the people that want trees buy. And so I think it's, it's a restriction that you're telling me I can't do something. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that just cannot handle that, to be told you can't do it this way.
The obsessive defiance disorder.
Yes.
When I worked in law enforcement for a while, you would see that attitude every now and then. I'm not going to listen to what my sergeant says or what my captain says. And I'll tell you now, they didn't last very long in law enforcement. And that's also one of the things that you'll see in the military. If you're not good at listening to directions, they're either going to break that out of you or you're not going to make it very long. But after seeing what God has done for us, it's hard for me to understand why people wouldn't want to submit to whatever he said. Anything else before we end the class? Anything that you were hoping to get out of the class that maybe we didn't talk about or discuss? And if y'all think of anything along those lines, just let me know. Who has the invitation tonight? Mike?